She swiped right on Marcus, a software engineer who suggested dinner at his family estate. But when the Uber dropped her at iron gates bearing ancient crests, and Marcus greeted her with fangs and a nervous smile, she realized her Tinder date was the vampire king's son. Now the entire undead court was watching to see if their prince's first human girlfriend would survive dessert. Elena stared at her phone screen, thumb hovering over the delete button for what felt like the 100th time this week. 3 disastrous Tinder dates in the past month had left her questioning whether genuine connection even existed in San Francisco's tech-saturated dating scene. The first guy had spent 2 hours explaining cryptocurrency while she picked at overpriced kale salad. The second had arrived 30 minutes late, reeking of energy drinks, and immediately launched into complaints about his startup's funding issues. The third had actually brought his laptop to dinner and answered work emails between courses. Each man had possessed the emotional depth of a LinkedIn profile and the conversational skills of a malfunctioning chatbot. Elena's finger moved toward the app's delete icon when a new match notification pinged across her screen. Marcus Chen, 26, software engineer. She almost swiped left on principle until his profile stopped her cold. Instead of the usual gym selfies and group shots at Coachella, his photos showed him reading in coffee shops, standing before Gothic cathedrals, sketching architectural details in a worn leather notebook. His bio mentioned a love for classical literature and old buildings, claiming he found more beauty in crumbling stone than gleaming glass towers. Their first message exchange had lasted until 3 in the morning, flowing from favorite novels to travel dreams to childhood memories with an ease that surprised them both. Unlike her recent dates, Marcus actually listened to her responses and built upon them rather than waiting for his turn to speak. When she mentioned her graphic design work restoring vintage movie posters, he'd asked thoughtful questions about color theory and typography that revealed genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. Over the next 2 weeks, their conversations deepened through a mix of texts and actual phone calls, a rarity that made Elena's heart flutter with old-fashioned delight. Marcus possessed an unusual formality in his speech patterns, choosing words with precision that reminded her of classic films from the 1940s. He never used abbreviations or emojis, crafting full sentences that felt like handwritten letters translated to digital format. When he suggested dinner at his family estate in Napa Valley, explaining he was house-sitting for traveling relatives who owned a small vineyard, Elena felt the first genuine excitement she'd experienced about a date in months. Her best friend Jessa had immediately launched into protective mode, rattling off statistics about online dating, dangers in insisting Elena share her location before meeting any stranger at a remote location. But something in Marcus's voice during their phone conversations, a quality of careful attention and old-world courtesy, had charmed Elena beyond her usual caution. He spoke about books and art and architecture with passion that felt authentic, unlike the performative enthusiasm of her previous dates. When he'd called the night before their planned meeting just to confirm she was still comfortable with the location and offered to meet somewhere more public if she preferred, Elena's instincts told her she'd finally found someone worth the risk. The Uber wound through increasingly remote stretches of Napa Valley as afternoon shadows lengthened across rolling vineyard hills. Elena checked her phone for the third time in 10 minutes, watching the signal bars dwindle from 4 to 2 to 1 as they climbed higher into the mountains. Her driver, a middle-aged man named Robert who'd been chatty for the first hour, had grown increasingly quiet as they left the main highway behind. Now he gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles and kept glancing at his GPS as if hoping it would suggest an alternate route. The roads had narrowed from smooth asphalt to weathered stone, lined with ancient oak trees whose gnarled branches formed a canopy that blocked most of the remaining daylight. When ornate iron gates finally appeared through the gathering dusk, Robert actually braked so hard that Elena lurched forward against her seatbelt. The gates rose at least 12 feet high, wrought iron twisted into intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. At their center, an elaborate family crest displayed symbols Elena couldn't identify, though something about their angular shapes made her skin prickle with unease. Twin stone pillars flanked the entrance, each topped with a gargoyle whose expression seemed to track their approach. Robert studied the GPS screen with obvious confusion before muttering under his breath about the address being wrong. But Elena insisted this had to be the place, since no other structures were visible for miles in any direction. As the gates swung open with a grinding sound that suggested centuries of use, Robert's hands trembled slightly on the wheel. He drove through at barely 5 miles per hour, as if expecting the entrance to snap shut behind them like a trap. The driveway stretched for nearly a mile through increasingly wild landscape where cultivated vineyard rows gave way to ancient forest, thick with shadows that moved independently of any wind. When the castle finally came into view, Elena's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't the charming wine country estate she'd imagined, but a genuine medieval fortress that belonged in a European history textbook rather than Northern California. Gothic spires pierced the storm clouds gathering overhead, their points disappearing into mist that seemed to cling to the structure with supernatural persistence. Gargoyles perched along every roofline, their stone eyes glinting with malevolent intelligence as lightning began to flicker in the distance. Robert stopped the car at the base of stone steps that led to massive oak doors banded with black iron, but he refused to turn off the engine. His voice shook as he asked if Elena was absolutely certain she wanted him to leave her at this place, and when she assured him the arrangement was intentional, he practically threw her overnight bag from the trunk before speeding away with gravel flying from his tires. Elena climbed the stone steps on unsteady legs, each footfall echoing against the castle walls like a countdown to some unknown fate. The massive oak doors stood at least 10 feet tall, their dark wood carved with more symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Before she could locate a doorbell or knocker, one door swung open with perfect silence to reveal Marcus waiting in the entrance hall. He looked exactly like his photos but somehow different, as if the camera had failed to capture some essential quality that was now blazingly apparent in person. His smile was warm and welcoming, yet carried an edge of nervousness that made Elena's pulse quicken with warning signals she couldn't quite interpret. When lightning flashed across the sky behind her, illuminating his face in stark relief, she saw what her mind initially refused to process. Two elongated canine teeth gleamed white against his lips, sharp points that definitely hadn't been visible in any of his carefully curated profile pictures. Marcus must have noticed her expression change because his smile faltered and he let out a nervous laugh that echoed strangely in the cavernous entrance hall. He ran one hand through his dark hair and looked everywhere except directly at her eyes, as he said he'd forgotten to mention one small detail about himself during their conversations. The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other as he explained that he was what most people would probably call a vampire, though he much preferred to think of himself as simply different rather than monstrous. Elena's mind struggled to process this information while her survival instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ancient stone floor as the reality of her situation crashed down with crushing weight. She was alone, miles from civilization, with no cell phone signal and no transportation, standing before a creature who could presumably kill her with minimal effort. The romantic evening she'd imagined had transformed into a nightmare scenario that her rational mind insisted couldn't be real, yet the evidence of her own eyes left no room for denial. Marcus continued speaking in soothing tones, explaining that he'd wanted to tell her sooner, but hadn't known how to bring up such an unusual topic in casual conversation, and that he'd chosen this location specifically because they could speak openly without fear of being overheard or misunderstood by regular humans who wouldn't comprehend their situation. Marcus gestured for Elena to follow him deeper into the castle, his movements graceful in a way that suggested inhuman strength carefully controlled. The entrance hall stretched upward for 3 stories, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Massive oil paintings lined the marble walls, each depicting a man who bore Marcus's exact features, but wearing clothing from different historical periods, spanning what appeared to be several centuries. Renaissance doublets gave way to Victorian formal wear, and then to military uniforms from various European conflicts. Yet the face remained identical in every portrait down to the precise curve of his smile and the distinctive shape of his dark eyes. Elena's phone showed no signal bars, the screen displaying only an emergency calls only message that made her stomach clench with renewed fear. Marcus noticed her checking the device and apologized with genuine regret, explaining that the castle's stone walls and remote location made modern communication difficult, though he assured her she was perfectly safe and could contact the outside world from the landline in his rooms if necessary. He led her through corridor after corridor lined with ancient tapestries and suits of armor that seemed to watch their progress with empty eye sockets. His voice carried an odd formality as he explained that she wasn't simply meeting his family for dinner, but rather being presented to his father and the royal council of what he termed the nocturnal court. The word dinner, he admitted with obvious discomfort, was perhaps a misleading description of the evening's true purpose, though he insisted his feelings for her were genuine regardless of the formal protocols they would need to observe. Elena realized with growing horror that this wasn't a casual date, but some kind of audition or evaluation, though for what purpose she couldn't begin to guess. As they walked deeper into the castle's maze of corridors, ancient vampires began to emerge from shadowed alcoves and side passages, their pale faces studying Elena with the dispassionate interest of scientists observing a laboratory specimen. Some appeared young, while others bore the weight of centuries in their eyes, but all possessed an otherworldly beauty that felt cold and predatory despite their perfect features. They whispered among themselves in languages Elena couldn't identify, their voices carrying the sibilant quality of wind through autumn leaves. Marcus's nervous energy increased as they approached a pair of doors that rose nearly to the corridor's ceiling, their dark wood carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when Elena wasn't looking directly at them. He paused before opening them, turning to Elena with an expression of desperate apology as he tried to prepare her for what lay beyond. The doors swung open to reveal a throne room that belonged in medieval legend rather than modern California, its black stone walls lit by torches that cast dancing shadows across ancient banners and heraldic displays. At the room's far end, an obsidian throne dominated a raised dais, and upon that throne sat a figure that made every instinct Elena possessed scream warnings of mortal danger. King Vladislav Dracul materialized from the shadows surrounding his seat of power, like darkness given form, his presence filling the chamber with an authority that transcended mere physical intimidation. His eyes held the cold light of winter stars, ancient beyond measure, yet burning with intelligence that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. When he spoke, his voice carried the grinding sound of stone against stone, each word precisely enunciated with an accent that suggested origins in distant centuries and forgotten kingdoms. Elena understood with crystalline clarity that she stood before a being who could end her life with a thought, and that her survival now depended on navigating rules and protocols she didn't understand in a world where her humanity marked her as prey rather than guest. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. A vampire in midnight blue robes appeared at Elena's elbow, his presence so sudden and silent that she jumped despite herself. Without speaking, he gestured toward another set of massive doors that opened onto the castle's formal dining hall, a chamber that defied every expectation Elena had formed about vampire gatherings. Instead of cobwebs and decay, the room gleamed with polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers that cast prismatic light across walls lined with tapestries depicting centuries of vampire history. At the center stood a dining table carved from what appeared to be a single enormous tree, its surface polished to mirror brightness and stretching nearly 30 feet in length. 12 chairs surrounded the table, each occupied by a vampire whose presence suggested centuries of accumulated power and influence. Their clothing ranged from medieval robes to Renaissance finery to modern evening wear, yet all bore the unmistakable mark of creatures who had transcended mortal concerns about fashion or convention. Marcus appeared at Elena's side with footsteps that made no sound against the marble floor. His earlier nervousness replaced by rigid formality that suggested he was following protocols learned through decades of repetition. He leaned close to whisper urgent instructions in her ear, his breath carrying the strange coolness she was beginning to associate with vampire physiology. "Never refuse anything offered directly," he murmured, as such refusal would be interpreted as rejection of the entire court's hospitality. Always wait for his father to speak before responding to any question, regardless of who posed the inquiry initially. Most importantly, never ask about the 13th chair that sat empty at the table's head beside the Vampire King's own seat, as that place remained reserved for his mother, who had died long before Elena's birth. The whispered rules felt like navigating a minefield where any misstep could prove fatal, yet Elena had no choice but to memorize them quickly as a vampire in elaborate crimson robes pulled out her designated chair. The seating arrangement placed her directly across from King Vladislav, who watched her every movement with eyes that seemed to catalog each gesture for future analysis. To her left sat a vampire woman, whose beauty carried the sharp edge of broken glass, her silver hair arranged in elaborate braids that suggested Byzantine court fashion. This was Lady Morgana, Marcus explained in barely audible tones, his father's chief advisor and the individual responsible for evaluating potential additions to their bloodline. Lady Morgana held an ornate quill pen above a piece of parchment that appeared to be covered in symbols rather than conventional writing, and Elena realized with growing unease that her every micro-expression was being documented for later review. The first course arrived without ceremony, carried by servants whose movements suggested the same inhuman grace that characterized all the vampires Elena had encountered. Crystal plates were placed before each diner with precise choreography, revealing portions of raw meat that still seemed to pulse with residual life. The flesh appeared to have been carved from some large animal, though Elena couldn't identify the source, and the sight of blood pooling around the edges made her stomach clench with revulsion. She had been a vegetarian for over a decade, initially for health reasons, but increasingly from ethical conviction about animal welfare, and the thought of consuming raw flesh violated every dietary principle she held. Yet Marcus's whispered warnings about refusing offered hospitality echoed in her mind as she stared at the plate before her, understanding that her personal choices had somehow become a potential diplomatic incident in a world where she understood none of the rules. King Vladislav lifted his own portion with fingers that ended in nails sharp enough to serve as weapons, bringing the bloody meat to his lips with obvious relish, while his cold gaze remained fixed on Elena's face. The message was clear without words. She was expected to follow his example, and any hesitation would be noted as a failure to adapt to vampire customs. Lady Morgana's quill moved across her parchment with soft scratching sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence, recording Elena's reaction to this first test of cultural assimilation. The other vampires at the table had paused in their own dining to observe how she would handle this initial challenge, their ancient faces displaying various degrees of curiosity and skepticism. Elena's hands trembled as she reached for her silverware, knowing that her next actions would determine whether she was viewed as a worthy addition to their society or simply another failed experiment in human-vampire relations. The silence stretched until King Vladislav finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like ice cracking under pressure. He announced that the evening's gathering served a purpose beyond simple social dining, though his tone suggested that Elena's presence was more burden than pleasure for the assembled court. This human, he declared while gesturing toward Elena with obvious distaste, had somehow managed to capture his son's attention to a degree that warranted formal evaluation by the vampire nobility. The words carried centuries of accumulated authority, each syllable precisely enunciated to emphasize the gravity of what Elena had stumbled into through her innocent Tinder swipes. Marcus had brought humans before the court on previous occasions, the vampire king continued, his pale lips curving into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. 3 women over the past several decades had sat in Elena's current chair, each believing herself to be special enough to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal worlds. Their portraits now decorated the castle's lower chambers, painted in their final moments as permanent reminders of human inadequacy when faced with vampire standards. The first had been a ballerina from Paris in 1987, whose grace and artistry had initially impressed the court until she'd proven unable to comprehend the sacrifices required for eternal existence. The second had been a scholar from Oxford in 1999, whose intelligence had seemed promising until she'd attempted to negotiate the terms of her transformation, rather than accepting it as an honor beyond mortal comprehension. The third had been an artist from New York in 2010, whose creativity had briefly fascinated several court members until she'd shown insufficient respect for vampire hierarchy and tradition. Each had failed the tests designed to determine their worthiness, and each had met their end in accordance with ancient laws that forbade allowing mortals to leave with knowledge of vampire society. Lady Morgana produced a crystal goblet from beneath the table, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to move in the candlelight like living things. The vessel contained what appeared to be wine, though its color was too deep and rich for any grape variety Elena recognized, and when Lady Morgana placed it before her with ceremonial precision, the liquid seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. King Vladislav explained that this was wine mixed with royal vampire blood, a combination that would bind Elena permanently to their world if she chose to drink it. The transformation would be gradual but irreversible, beginning with enhanced senses and strength before progressing to the full range of vampire abilities over the course of several months. Accepting the goblet would demonstrate her commitment to joining their society and her willingness to abandon her human existence for something greater than mortal limitations. Refusing it, however, would be interpreted as rejection of their generous offer and would necessitate her immediate execution to protect the secrets she had witnessed during her brief time in their domain. The choice was hers to make, the Vampire King concluded, though he made it clear that only one option would allow her to see another sunrise. Elena stared at the goblet while her mind raced through implications she could barely comprehend, understanding that Marcus had brought her to a point of no return, where her survival depended on decisions she had never imagined needing to make. Marcus appeared beside Elena's chair as the court dispersed for what Lady Morgana announced would be a brief recess before the evening's final proceedings. His hand touched her shoulder with gentle pressure that conveyed both comfort and urgency, and he guided her from the dining hall through corridors she hadn't seen during their earlier journey to the throne room. The castle seemed to shift around them as they walked, passages appearing where none had existed moments before, as if the ancient stone responded to vampire will rather than fixed architectural principles. They climbed a spiral staircase that wound upward for what felt like hundreds of steps, passing windows that showed views of landscape that couldn't possibly exist in Northern California. Moonlight streamed through stained glass that depicted scenes of vampire history, casting colored shadows that danced across the stone walls with each flicker of the torches mounted in iron sconces. The library Marcus led her to occupied what must have been an entire tower, its shelves stretching from floor to ceiling in concentric circles around a central reading area furnished with leather chairs that looked older than most civilizations. Books in languages Elena couldn't identify filled every available space, their leather bindings bearing symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Marcus closed the heavy wooden door behind them and activated what appeared to be some form of magical privacy ward, gesturing over the lock with fingers that traced patterns in the air until blue light flickered briefly around the doorframe. Only then did his formal court composure crumble, revealing the anguish that had been hidden beneath his careful control throughout the evening's proceedings. He sank into one of the ancient chairs and buried his face in hands that trembled with emotion Elena hadn't expected from someone who appeared so composed in his father's presence. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of loneliness that had accumulated over more than a century of existence without genuine connection. He explained that he had been alive since 1897, transformed at the age of 26 when his father decided the family line required an heir to carry on vampire traditions. The decades that followed had been filled with arranged introductions to suitable vampire women from other noble families, each encounter carefully orchestrated to produce political alliances rather than personal compatibility. Yet none of those relationships had generated the spark of recognition he'd found in Elena's messages, the sense of meeting someone who understood his thoughts before he finished expressing them. The dating apps had been his rebellion against centuries of suffocating tradition, his attempt to find connection based on genuine attraction rather than bloodline politics. He had crafted his profile carefully to present his human passing characteristics while concealing the supernatural elements that would complicate any normal relationship, knowing that revelation would eventually become necessary, but hoping to build a foundation of genuine feeling before that moment arrived. Now, however, he realized the trap his deception had created, understanding too late that bringing Elena into his world had condemned her to face tests designed to eliminate human contamination from vampire society. His father would never allow her to leave alive with knowledge of their existence, regardless of whether she passed the court's evaluations or failed them spectacularly. Marcus had doomed the one person who had made him feel human in over a century of immortal existence, and the weight of that realization crushed him with guilt that no amount of supernatural strength could overcome. Elena listened to his confession while studying the ancient books that surrounded them, their presence a reminder of how much history and knowledge existed beyond her human understanding, and she began to grasp the true complexity of the choice she faced in the goblet waiting downstairs. When the library door opened without warning, Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as King Vladislav entered with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known fear in 8 centuries of existence. His presence filled the circular chamber like winter fog, making the ancient books seem to shrink back into their shelves, as if seeking protection from his attention. Marcus immediately rose from his chair and assumed the rigid posture Elena recognized as court protocol, though his face remained pale with the emotional exhaustion of his confession. The vampire king's cold gaze swept over them both with calculating precision, and Elena realized that their private conversation had likely been monitored despite Marcus's attempts at magical privacy. King Vladislav moved to the center of the library with steps that made no sound against the stone floor, his ancient robes rustling like autumn leaves in a graveyard wind. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of centuries and the authority of absolute power over life and death in his domain. He had come to inform them of a decision that would alter the trajectory of the evening's events. Though his tone suggested this change brought him no particular pleasure. Lady Morgana and the other council members had spent their brief recess reviewing Elena's performance during the dinner proceedings, analyzing every gesture and micro-expression she had displayed when faced with vampire customs and expectations. Their evaluation had yielded results that surprised even the vampire king, though he admitted this fact with obvious reluctance. Elena's refusal to consume the raw meat had initially been interpreted as cultural weakness, yet her composed dignity in the face of impossible circumstances had demonstrated a strength of character that impressed vampires who had witnessed human nature in all its varieties over many lifetimes. More significantly, her reaction to learning about the 3 previous women who had failed the court's tests had shown neither panic nor submission, but rather a calculating intelligence that began assessing the situation for potential solutions rather than accepting defeat as inevitable. These qualities, combined with her obvious effect on Marcus's typically controlled demeanor, had led the ancient council to invoke a law that had remained dormant for nearly 2 centuries. King Vladislav paused in his explanation, studying Elena's face with eyes that had watched the rise and fall of empires, before revealing the existence of the right of consort selection. This ancient protocol, established over 800 years ago by his own predecessor, allowed humans of exceptional quality to challenge for a place in vampire nobility through a series of 3 trials designed to test their worthiness for immortal existence. The law had been created during a time when vampire bloodlines faced extinction due to inbreeding and isolation, providing a mechanism for introducing fresh genetic material and new perspectives into their stagnant society. However, the right had been invoked only 7 times throughout vampire history, with merely 2 humans successfully completing all 3 trials and earning their place among the immortal nobility. The others had perished in ways that served as cautionary tales about the price of attempting to bridge the gap between mortal and supernatural worlds. Elena would face trials of mind, body, and heart, each designed to push her beyond the normal limitations of human capability while testing her commitment to abandoning her former existence for something far greater and more dangerous. Success would grant her protection under vampire law as Marcus's consort, transforming her into a being capable of existing as an equal among creatures who had transcended mortal concerns about time and death. Failure in any single trial would result in her immediate execution, though her death would at least serve the purpose of demonstrating to future humans the folly of aspiring beyond their natural station. The twist that made King Vladislav's announcement particularly devastating was his revelation that Marcus had never been informed of this law's existence. For over a century, the vampire prince had believed that bringing humans to court would inevitably result in their deaths, leading him to avoid meaningful relationships rather than condemn innocent women to destruction. His father had deliberately concealed the right's existence, using Marcus's ignorance as a tool to eliminate unwanted human attachments while maintaining the illusion that no alternatives existed. The 3 previous women had indeed been offered the trials, though their failures had been presented to Marcus as evidence of human inadequacy, rather than missed opportunities for genuine partnership. This deception had served the Vampire King's purposes by keeping his son isolated and dependent on court-arranged relationships that would serve political rather than personal interests. Now, however, Lady Morgana and the ancient council members had forced his hand by invoking the right publicly, making it impossible for him to refuse without appearing weak before vampires who valued strength and honor above all other considerations. Elena realized that she had inadvertently become the center of a power struggle that had been brewing beneath the surface of vampire politics for decades, with her survival dependent on navigating challenges she couldn't yet comprehend. Marcus stared at his father with an expression of betrayal so profound that Elena could practically feel the centuries of manipulation crashing down around him like the ruins of everything he had believed about his existence and choices. The Vampire King observed his son's reaction with the detached interest of a scientist, studying a particularly interesting specimen, showing no remorse for the deception that had shaped Marcus's emotional isolation throughout his immortal life. King Vladislav explained that the council's decision to invoke the right was not subject to royal veto, as the ancient laws predated his own reign and carried authority that even vampire monarchs were bound to respect. Elena would have until dawn to prepare for the first trial, which would begin at sunset the following evening and continue for 3 consecutive nights until she either proved her worthiness or met her end in accordance with vampire justice. The trials themselves would test capabilities she didn't know she possessed while forcing her to confront fears and limitations that defined her human existence, pushing her beyond normal mortal boundaries into territory where only the strongest survived. Lady Morgana entered the library, as if summoned by some invisible signal, carrying an ornate scroll that contained the formal rules and protocols governing the right of consort selection. Her silver hair gleamed in the torchlight as she unrolled the parchment with ceremonial precision, revealing text, written in multiple languages that seemed to shift and change as Elena attempted to read them. The ancient vampire woman explained that Elena would face the trial of mind first, testing her intelligence and problem-solving abilities against challenges that had defeated scholars and philosophers throughout vampire history. The trial of body would follow, examining her physical courage and determination when confronted with supernatural obstacles designed to exploit human weaknesses and limitations. Finally, the trial of heart would evaluate her emotional commitment to the transformation from mortal to immortal existence, forcing her to choose between competing loyalties that would define the rest of her potentially eternal life. Each trial would take place in a different location within the castle's supernatural architecture, utilizing magical properties that had been accumulated and refined over centuries of vampire occupation. Elena would face these challenges alone, as no assistance from Marcus or any other vampire would be permitted under the ancient protocols that governed the rite's implementation. Success would grant her not just survival, but elevation to a status that would make her one of the most powerful beings in the supernatural world, with abilities and longevity that would allow her to stand as an equal among creatures who had transcended every mortal limitation. Failure would result in her death, though Lady Morgana assured her that such an end would be swift and honorable rather than prolonged or torturous, as the trials were designed to test worthiness rather than inflict unnecessary suffering. The choice to accept or decline the trials remained Elena's to make, though refusing them would simply return her to the original ultimatum involving the goblet of blood and wine that waited in the dining hall. Elena looked between Marcus's anguished face and his father's cold satisfaction, understanding that she had stumbled into a situation where her personal choices had become entangled with centuries of vampire politics and family dysfunction, and where her survival depended on succeeding at challenges that had defeated individuals with far more knowledge and preparation than she currently possessed. The following evening arrived with storm clouds that seemed to press against the castle's ancient stones, like living things seeking entry to witness the trials that would determine Elena's fate. Lady Morgana appeared at her chamber door as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, carrying a silver chalice filled with liquid that shimmered with its own inner light. The potion would enhance Elena's human senses to supernatural levels for the duration of the trial, allowing her to perceive the magical properties of the library's contents while simultaneously making her more vulnerable to their influence. Elena drank the bitter mixture despite its metallic taste that coated her tongue like liquid mercury, feeling immediate changes as her vision sharpened to reveal details previously invisible, and her hearing expanded to catch whispers that seemed to emanate from the castle's very walls. Lady Morgana led her through corridors that twisted in impossible directions, past doorways that opened onto rooms that couldn't exist within the castle's physical structure, until they reached a library that bore no resemblance to the comfortable reading room where Marcus had made his confession. This chamber stretched upward beyond the reach of torchlight, its shelves climbing into darkness that seemed to swallow illumination rather than simply reflecting it. Books filled every available surface in chaotic arrangements that suggested centuries of accumulation without any organizing principle beyond the whims of supernatural collectors who valued knowledge above accessibility. The air itself felt thick with accumulated wisdom and madness, carrying whispers in languages that predated human civilization, while shadows moved between the shelves with purposeful intelligence that made Elena's enhanced senses recoil in instinctive warning. Lady Morgana explained the trial's parameters with the precise diction of someone reciting ancient law. Elena had 1 hour to locate the chronicle of Marcus's bloodline among the thousands of volumes that filled this supernatural repository, then answer 3 questions about vampire history that would be posed by the library itself once she found the correct text. The books contained more than simple written knowledge, however, as many volumes held the trapped souls of vampire scholars who had devoted their immortal existences to research before being absorbed into their own work as a form of eternal preservation. These spirits would attempt to seduce Elena's consciousness into joining their endless studies, offering glimpses of infinite knowledge in exchange for her freedom and sanity. The library's supernatural properties meant that time moved differently within its walls, with minutes stretching into hours for unwary visitors who became lost in the maze of knowledge and temptation. Elena must resist these influences while using her human perspective to solve puzzles that had challenged vampire minds for centuries, drawing upon skills and insights that immortal beings might overlook due to their separation from mortal experience. Lady Morgana's final warning carried particular emphasis, as she explained that the library fed on intellectual curiosity, growing stronger as visitors delved deeper into its mysteries, and that many previous challengers had been found decades later, their bodies perfectly preserved but their minds completely absorbed into the collective consciousness that governed the chamber's supernatural ecosystem. The silver hourglass Lady Morgana placed on a reading pedestal began its countdown immediately, sand falling with soft whispers that seemed to echo Elena's heartbeat as she stepped into the labyrinth of knowledge that would either reveal the secrets she needed or claim her sanity as payment for trespassing in realms meant for immortal minds. The books began whispering her name before she had taken 10 steps into the library's depths, their voices carrying seductive promises of understanding that made her enhanced senses vibrate with dangerous attraction. Ancient tomes bound in leather that felt disturbingly warm to the touch called out with offers to explain the mysteries of vampire transformation, the secrets of immortal power, the hidden histories that shaped supernatural politics across centuries of hidden conflict. Elena forced herself to ignore these temptations while scanning the shelves for visual clues that might indicate the chronicle's location, drawing upon her graphic design training to recognize patterns in the elaborate symbols that decorated spine after spine of supernatural texts. The illuminated manuscripts glowed with their own inner light, their marginalia moving like living things as she passed, and she realized that the decorative elements served as more than mere artistic flourishes, but rather as organizational systems that encoded information about each book's contents and significance. Following this insight, she began tracing recurring motifs through the library's chaotic arrangement, noticing how certain symbols appeared more frequently in specific sections, while others seemed to cluster around volumes that radiated particular types of magical energy. A bat-winged symbol combined with a crown design appeared repeatedly in one alcove, and Elena's intuition suggested this might indicate texts related to royal vampire bloodlines and inheritance. The books in this section whispered more urgently as she approached, their voices overlapping in harmonies that threatened to overwhelm her concentration, with promises of knowledge about Marcus's family history, his father's rise to power, his mother's mysterious death, and the political machinations that had shaped vampire society for generations. One volume bound in midnight blue leather caught her attention, not because of its whispers, but because of its silence, sitting among the chattering tomes like a calm center in a storm of supernatural activity. The chronicle of the Dracul bloodline revealed itself through this very absence of obvious magical signature, its restraint suggesting the confidence of a text that needed no supernatural enhancement to command respect and attention. Elena pulled the volume from its shelf with hands that trembled from the magical energy saturating the library's atmosphere, feeling the weight of centuries in its pages as she opened to a frontispiece decorated with the same family crest she had seen on the castle's iron gates. The chronicle's pages turned themselves as she read, revealing genealogies that stretched back to the founding of vampire civilization, political alliances that had shaped supernatural history, and personal details about royal family members that explained the undercurrents of tension she had observed during her brief time at court. Most significantly, she discovered references to a weakness in the royal bloodline that made King Vladislav vulnerable to challenges based on ancient precedent, though the specific nature of this weakness was encoded in symbols that required careful analysis to decipher properly. The library's supernatural maze opened before Elena like a living creature as she completed the first trial, walls shifting to create new passages while the floor tilted at impossible angles that defied every law of physics she understood. Her success in finding the chronicle had apparently triggered the second trial without pause, transforming the scholarly repository into a gauntlet designed to test physical courage and determination rather than intellectual capability. The enhanced senses granted by Lady Morgana's potion now worked against her as every supernatural element in the shifting maze assaulted her perception with overwhelming intensity, making her feel like she was drowning in sensory information that her human mind struggled to process effectively. Corridors stretched and contracted around her as she moved, their stone walls sprouting thorns that caught at her clothing, while portraits hanging in ornate frames turned to follow her progress with eyes that held malevolent intelligence. The maze responded to her fears and insecurities with surgical precision, manifesting twisted echoes of her past relationships that stepped from the shadows to block her path forward. Her college boyfriend appeared with the same disappointed expression he had worn when breaking up with her for being too independent and career-focused. His accusations about her inability to compromise or prioritize relationships over professional ambitions echoing through corridors that amplified every cruel word until they became a chorus of condemnation. Her father materialized next, wearing the suit he had been wearing the day he left their family for a younger woman and a new life that didn't include the responsibilities of fatherhood, his familiar pattern of emotional abandonment playing out in supernatural detail as he explained once again why Elena wasn't worth fighting for or staying with despite her desperate childhood pleas. Each manifestation felt completely real despite her rational knowledge that these were magical constructs designed to exploit her psychological vulnerabilities, their emotional impact just as devastating as the original experiences that had shaped her protective instincts and fierce self-reliance. The maze fed on her pain and doubt, growing stronger as she struggled with memories of never being good enough, smart enough, interesting enough to keep the people she loved from eventually walking away when something better came along. Marcus appeared in a shadowed alcove, but this version of him wore the cold expression she had seen on his father's face, explaining with devastating politeness that their connection had been a temporary distraction from his real responsibilities to vampire society, and that she had been naive to think a creature of his power and immortality could find lasting value in something as brief and insignificant as human love. The maze's walls closed in around her as these psychological attacks intensified, creating a crushing sense of claustrophobia that made breathing difficult, while whispers filled the air with every self-doubt and insecurity she had ever harbored about her worthiness for love and acceptance. Elena realized that the trial was designed to break her spirit by forcing her to confront the possibility that all her fears about abandonment and inadequacy were fundamentally true, that she was indeed destined to be left behind by anyone who truly knew her weaknesses and limitations. But as the maze pressed closer and the whispers grew louder, something shifted in Elena's understanding of the challenge she faced. Instead of fighting against her perceived flaws and trying to prove them wrong, she began embracing the very characteristics that others had criticized throughout her life. Her stubbornness, which had been condemned as inflexibility, became the strength that refused to surrender to the maze's psychological manipulation. Her independence, which had been dismissed as inability to compromise, became the foundation that allowed her to trust her own judgment rather than accepting the negative voices that surrounded her. Her refusal to conform to others' expectations, which had been labeled as social difficulty, became the clarity that helped her see through the maze's illusions to recognize the test for what it truly was. The supernatural construct began to weaken as Elena stopped apologizing for who she was and started moving forward with confidence in her own worth and capabilities. Her acceptance of her authentic self creating cracks in the maze's psychological architecture that had been built on her willingness to doubt and diminish herself. The corridors straightened as she walked with increasing determination toward the maze's heart, where a simple wooden door waited without fanfare or supernatural enhancement, its ordinary appearance marking the end of a trial that had tested her relationship with herself more thoroughly than any external challenge could have managed. The hours between trials passed in a strange suspension of normal time as Elena found herself in Marcus's private chambers, a suite of rooms that blended medieval architecture with modern comforts in ways that reflected centuries of gradual adaptation to changing times. Heavy tapestries covered stone walls, while electric lighting had been carefully integrated to preserve the chamber's ancient atmosphere, creating an environment where past and present coexisted in the same uneasy balance that characterized Marcus's own existence between vampire nature and human longings. He appeared more vulnerable here than she had seen him in any other part of the castle, stripped of the formal protocols that governed his behavior in public spaces, and free to express the emotions that court etiquette demanded he suppress. His relief at her survival of the first two trials was palpable, yet underneath that gratitude lay a deeper current of amazement that anyone would willingly face such dangers for the possibility of a future with him. Elena curled up in an ancient chair whose leather had been worn smooth by centuries of use, accepting a cup of tea that Marcus had prepared with hands that still trembled slightly from watching her navigate challenges he had never known existed. Their conversation flowed with the easy intimacy of people who had been forced to compress months of normal relationship development into a few intense hours of shared crisis. She told him about the loneliness of her childhood after her father's abandonment, how she had learned to rely on herself because trusting others to stay had proven too painful when they inevitably chose to leave. Marcus shared his own experiences of emotional isolation, centuries spent trying to earn approval from a father who seemed incapable of expressing genuine affection or pride in his son's accomplishments. The Vampire King had always demanded perfection while withholding the emotional validation that might have made such perfection feel worthwhile, creating a cycle where Marcus constantly strived to prove his worth while never feeling truly seen or valued for who he was beneath his royal obligations. Their parallel experiences of parental emotional neglect had shaped them both in ways that made connections simultaneously precious and terrifying, as each had learned to protect themselves from further abandonment by avoiding the vulnerability that deep relationships required. Yet here they were, sharing secrets and fears with an openness that surprised them both, finding in each other the acceptance and understanding they had stopped believing was possible to find. Marcus traced patterns on Elena's hand while explaining how the dating apps had represented his first real rebellion against his father's control, his attempt to find someone who would choose him for himself rather than his title or supernatural abilities. Elena understood that feeling of wanting to be valued for authentic self rather than external circumstances, having dated too many men who seemed more interested in her appearance or professional success than in understanding her thoughts and dreams and fears. The connection they had discovered through digital messages had grown stronger rather than weaker when tested by supernatural crisis, proving that the foundation of genuine compatibility could withstand pressures that would destroy relationships based on superficial attraction or convenience. Lady Morgana's arrival interrupted their conversation with a soft knock that nonetheless conveyed urgency and importance. The ancient vampire advisor entered with the graceful precision that characterized all her movements, her silver hair catching the chamber's warm lighting as she delivered a warning that made both Elena and Marcus straighten with renewed tension. The final trial would test something more precious than Elena's life, Lady Morgana explained, as it would examine her willingness to sacrifice her human identity completely for the chance to remain with Marcus in his immortal world. The trial of heart would force her to choose between competing loyalties and values, presenting scenarios where saving one thing she loved would require destroying another equally important aspect of her existence. Previous challengers had failed this test not because they lacked courage or intelligence, but because they had been unwilling to pay the full price that transformation demanded, clinging to pieces of their former selves that made complete integration into vampire society impossible. Elena would face a choice that would define not just her survival, but the fundamental nature of who she would become if she succeeded, and Lady Morgana's expression suggested that this final challenge had broken stronger candidates than Elena might appear to be. The warning delivered, Lady Morgana departed as quietly as she had arrived, leaving Elena and Marcus to contemplate a future that seemed simultaneously within reach and impossibly fragile, dependent on decisions neither of them could fully prepare for or predict. The third night arrived with an unnatural stillness that seemed to press against the castle walls like a held breath, as if the ancient stones themselves anticipated the trial that would determine not just Elena's fate, but the future of supernatural politics within the nocturnal court. Lady Morgana appeared at Elena's chamber door precisely at midnight, her expression more grave than Elena had yet seen as she carried a single black candle whose flame cast shadows that moved independently of any natural light source. The final trial would take place in the castle's heart chamber, a room that existed at the intersection of all the supernatural forces that had accumulated within these walls over 8 centuries of vampire occupation. Elena followed the ancient advisor through corridors that seemed to shift and breathe around them, past doorways that opened onto views of distant landscapes under alien stars, until they reached a circular chamber carved from living rock that pulsed with its own supernatural heartbeat. King Vladislav waited at the chamber's center beside Marcus, who appeared pale even by vampire standards, and moved with the careful precision of someone fighting against physical weakness that threatened to overwhelm his supernatural strength. The vampire king's cold smile carried satisfaction that made Elena's enhanced senses recoil with instinctive warning as he began explaining the parameters of the trial of heart with the measured cadence of someone who had orchestrated this scenario according to his own careful design. Marcus had been poisoned with a toxin that affected only vampire royalty, a rare substance extracted from plants that grew in supernatural soil and refined through alchemical processes that required centuries of accumulated knowledge to perfect properly. The poison worked slowly but inevitably, weakening his immortal constitution until his enhanced healing abilities could no longer compensate for the damage spreading through his supernatural physiology. Without an antidote administered within the next hour, Marcus would experience true death, rather than the temporary weakness that typically characterized vampire vulnerability to mortal weapons and conventional toxins. King Vladislav produced a crystal vial containing liquid that shimmered with pearl-like luminescence, explaining that this antidote could save his son's existence, but came with conditions that would test the genuine nature of Elena's proclaimed love for the vampire prince. She could administer the life-saving medicine and watch Marcus recover completely from the poison's effects, but only if she agreed to leave the castle immediately afterward and never attempt to contact him again for the remainder of her mortal existence. Additionally, her memories of everything that had occurred during her time in the supernatural world would be erased through vampire magic, returning her to her normal human life with no knowledge of Marcus's true nature or the trials she had endured to prove her worthiness for immortal transformation. The alternative was equally stark in its implications. Elena could refuse to accept these conditions and remain with Marcus as the poison completed its lethal work, knowing that her failure to save his life would constitute failure of the trial and result in her own execution according to the ancient laws that governed vampire justice. King Vladislav's eyes glittered with cruel satisfaction as he presented this impossible choice, explaining that the trial of heart was designed to determine whether Elena's feelings represented genuine love that prioritized Marcus's welfare above her own desires, or merely selfish attachment that used affection as a mask for personal ambition and the pursuit of supernatural power. The Vampire King had witnessed too many humans who claimed to love his son while actually seeking the immortality and abilities that came with vampire transformation, using emotional manipulation to gain access to powers they could never achieve through their own mortal limitations. This final test would strip away all pretense and reveal the true nature of Elena's motivations, forcing her to choose between her lover's survival and her own continued existence in his world. Marcus tried to speak, his voice weakened by the poison's effects, but still carrying desperate urgency as he attempted to tell Elena to save herself and accept the memory erasure, rather than dying for someone she had known for only a few intense days. The Vampire King silenced his son with a gesture that carried the weight of absolute authority, explaining that Marcus was forbidden to influence Elena's decision in any way, as the trial's validity depended on her making this choice based purely on her own values and priorities. Elena stared at the antidote while her mind raced through implications that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, understanding that King Vladislav had designed this scenario to ensure that no outcome would threaten his control over his son's emotional life and political future. If she chose to save Marcus and leave, the vampire prince would remain isolated and dependent on his father's guidance for companionship and purpose. If she chose to stay and die with Marcus, the Vampire King would have eliminated both the relationship that threatened his authority and the son whose growing independence had become problematic for maintaining traditional power structures within the court. The supposed trial was actually an execution disguised as a test, designed to remove obstacles to King Vladislav's continued dominance while maintaining the illusion that ancient laws and honorable traditions guided vampire society rather than the personal whims of a tyrannical monarch who had grown corrupt through centuries of unchallenged power. Elena stood in the heart chamber's pulsing supernatural atmosphere and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the situation that had trapped both her and Marcus in an impossible scenario. The trial of heart was indeed a test, but not the one King Vladislav claimed to be administering through his cruel ultimatum between love and survival. Instead, it was a trial of her willingness to accept injustice disguised as tradition, to participate in a system that used ancient laws as weapons against anyone who threatened established power structures. She looked at the antidote in the Vampire King's pale hands and realized that the real test lay in recognizing that some choices should never be forced upon anyone, regardless of the supposed honor or tradition that justified such cruelty. A parent who would poison his own child to manipulate someone else's emotions was not upholding sacred laws, but rather perverting them for personal gain, and Elena's acceptance of this impossible situation would make her complicit in a cycle of abuse that had probably destroyed countless relationships throughout vampire history. Her voice carried new strength as she refused to choose between the false options King Vladislav had presented, instead challenging the fundamental premise that justified forcing such a decision in the first place. The information she had discovered in the Chronicle of Marcus's bloodline had revealed crucial details about the royal family's history, including the truth about Marcus's mother and the circumstances of her death decades earlier. Queen Isabella had been human before her transformation, chosen through the same rite of consort selection that Elena had been enduring, yet she had died not from any external threat, but from the emotional destruction caused by her husband's controlling behavior and the court's systematic isolation from anything that reminded her of her human origins. The Vampire King had slowly poisoned his wife's spirit through the same manipulative tactics he now employed against Elena, using ancient laws and traditions as justification for cruelty that served no purpose beyond maintaining his absolute authority over everyone within his domain. Elena's passionate speech filled the heart chamber as she argued that vampire society's isolation had made them cruel and stagnant, trapped in patterns of behavior that served power rather than wisdom or justice. Their separation from human values had allowed them to forget basic concepts of compassion and genuine love, replacing these foundations of healthy relationships with political calculations and the pursuit of dominance over others. The ancient laws they claimed to honor had been corrupted into tools for maintaining control rather than protecting the principles they were originally designed to preserve, and Elena refused to participate in perpetuating this cycle of manipulation disguised as noble tradition. Her words echoed against the chamber's living stone walls with supernatural resonance that seemed to awaken something long dormant within the castle's magical architecture, as if the very foundations of vampire society were responding to challenges they had not heard in centuries of enforced conformity and silence. Marcus struggled to his feet, despite the poison's weakening effects, his voice gaining strength as Elena's courage inspired him to finally confront the truth about his father's treatment of everyone who had ever threatened the Vampire King's emotional control. The ancient nobles who had gathered to witness the trial began murmuring among themselves in languages that predated human civilization, their conversations carrying undertones of political uncertainty that suggested Elena's words had struck deeper than King Vladislav had anticipated when he designed this supposedly foolproof test. The heart chamber filled with supernatural tension as Elena's challenge to vampire tradition created the first genuine political crisis in the nocturnal court for over 2 centuries, with ancient alliances beginning to fracture along lines that had remained stable since the current power structure had been established through conquest and intimidation. Lady Morgana stepped forward from the shadows where she had been observing the trial's proceedings, her silver hair gleaming in the chamber's pulsing light as she revealed information that transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation between Elena and King Vladislav. For decades, she had been documenting the court's failures and cruelties in secret records that catalogued every abuse of power, every manipulation disguised as tradition, every life destroyed by the Vampire King's need to maintain absolute control over his subjects and family. The ancient advisor had been waiting for someone with sufficient courage and moral clarity to speak truth to power, someone willing to challenge the corrupt interpretation of vampire law that had turned noble principles into weapons against the innocent and vulnerable. Elena's refusal to accept false choices had finally provided the catalyst for reform that Lady Morgana had hoped to see throughout her centuries of service to a court system that had gradually abandoned justice in favor of political expediency and the preservation of existing hierarchies. Half the Vampire Council supported Elena's challenge to traditional authority, recognizing wisdom in her arguments about how isolation from human values had corrupted their society's moral foundations and turned them into parasites who fed on cruelty as much as blood. These nobles had witnessed the gradual degradation of vampire culture over the centuries, watching as fear of change and obsession with maintaining power had replaced the intellectual curiosity and ethical sophistication that had once characterized immortal civilization at its peak. They understood that Elena represented an opportunity for renewal and growth that might save vampire society from the spiritual stagnation that threatened to destroy them more thoroughly than any external enemy could manage through conventional warfare or persecution. The other half of the council demanded Elena's immediate execution for the insult to their ancient ways, arguing that allowing a mere human to question vampire law would set a precedent that could undermine the entire social structure that had preserved their species through centuries of challenges and conflicts. These traditionalists viewed any change as dangerous weakness that would invite chaos and destruction, preferring the stability of known systems even when those systems had become corrupt and destructive to the people they were supposed to protect and serve. Marcus found the strength to stand despite his weakening condition, his voice carrying new authority as he denounced his father's cruelty and manipulation, while declaring his support for Elena's challenge to the court's degraded moral standards. The vampire prince had finally recognized the pattern of emotional abuse that had shaped his entire immortal existence. Understanding how his father had used isolation and fear to maintain control, while preventing the genuine connections that might have allowed Marcus to develop into an independent leader capable of bringing positive change to vampire society. King Vladislav faced his first real political crisis in centuries as his absolute authority cracked under pressure from subjects who had finally found the courage to question his decisions and the supposed traditions he used to justify increasingly arbitrary exercises of power. The castle itself seemed to respond to the supernatural tension filling the heart chamber, ancient protective spells beginning to flicker and weaken as the magical foundations that supported the Vampire King's rule were undermined by the growing recognition that his leadership had become more destructive than beneficial to the people he claimed to serve. Stone walls began to crack with the sound of thunder as centuries of accumulated supernatural energy sought new channels for expression, the very architecture of vampire power shifting in response to political upheaval that challenged every assumption about immortal society's future direction and leadership. Elena stood at the center of this supernatural storm, her human perspective providing the catalyst for changes that vampire minds had been unable to envision due to their separation from the moral principles that had once guided their civilization toward wisdom and justice, rather than mere survival and dominance over others. King Vladislav's fury erupted like a volcanic force that had been building pressure for centuries, his ancient features contorting with rage that transformed his aristocratic composure into something primal and terrifying beyond human comprehension. The challenge to his absolute authority represented more than political opposition. It struck at the core identity he had built through 800 years of unchallenged rule, threatening to expose him as a tyrant rather than the wise monarch he believed himself to be. His voice rose to a pitch that made the heart chamber's stone walls vibrate with supernatural resonance as he declared Elena's immediate execution for the crime of questioning vampire law and corrupting his son's loyalty through human weakness and sentimentality. The Vampire King raised his hand with fingers that extended into claws capable of tearing through steel, supernatural energy crackling around his form like lightning, seeking earth as he prepared to end both Elena's life and the political crisis she had created through her refusal to accept the natural order that placed vampire wisdom above human ignorance. But Marcus moved between his father and Elena with speed that surprised everyone present, his weakened condition overcome by reserves of strength that Elena's courage had awakened within his supernatural physiology. For over a century, the vampire prince had submitted to his father's authority out of duty and the belief that obedience represented the highest virtue for someone born into royal responsibility. Yet witnessing Elena's moral clarity had shown him the difference between genuine honor and mere compliance with corrupt power structures. His voice carried new authority as he denounced King Vladislav's cruelty and manipulation, centuries of repressed resentment finally exploding into the open as he accused his father of using ancient traditions as weapons against anyone who threatened his emotional control over the court's political direction. The confrontation between father and son escalated beyond mere argument, into a battle that encompassed both physical and psychological warfare, with supernatural forces crackling through the air as their opposing wills created tension that threatened to tear apart the magical foundations supporting the castle's existence. Marcus fought not just for Elena's survival, but for his right to choose his own path without interference from a parent who had consistently used love as a tool for manipulation rather than genuine support for his son's growth and independence. King Vladislav's attacks combined supernatural strength with centuries of combat experience, his claws leaving deep gouges in stone walls, while his voice wielded ancient words that carried the power to bind and control vampire minds through magical compulsion. Yet Marcus matched his father's fury with determination, fueled by decades of accumulated frustration and the recognition that submission to unjust authority had made him complicit in the court's moral degradation over the centuries. Their battle raged through the heart chamber with destructive force that sent cracks racing through the ancient stonework. each impact of supernatural strength against supernatural strength, creating shockwaves that disrupted the castle's carefully balanced magical ecosystem. Elena pressed herself against the chamber wall as the two vampires fought with inhuman speed and strength, their movements creating blurs of motion punctuated by impacts that sounded like thunder trapped within stone walls designed to contain forces beyond normal comprehension. The castle itself seemed to respond to the emotional upheaval tearing apart the royal family, ancient magic crackling through stones that had absorbed supernatural energy for centuries, while serving as the focal point for vampire political power throughout multiple dynastic transitions. Windows began shattering throughout the structure as the magical resonance created by the father-son conflict exceeded the architectural limits designed to contain normal vampire activities. And Elena realized that the entire fortress was becoming unstable under the pressure of forces that had been held in careful balance for generations through royal authority that was now fragmenting beyond repair. Lady Morgana's voice cut through the supernatural chaos with words that carried the weight of centuries-long deception finally being exposed to public scrutiny, her revelation about Marcus's mother transforming the political crisis into something far more devastating for King Vladislav's remaining support among the vampire nobility. Queen Isabella had not died from weakness or any external threat as the official court histories claimed, but rather had been murdered by her own husband when she attempted to reform the cruel traditions that had made vampire society a source of suffering rather than wisdom and strength. The human-born queen had tried to convince the court to abandon practices like the impossible trials and manipulative tests that destroyed genuine relationships in favor of political calculations, arguing that their isolation from human values had corrupted their judgment and turned them into parasites who fed on cruelty as much as blood. Her efforts at reform had threatened King Vladislav's absolute authority over every aspect of court life, challenging his ability to use ancient laws as weapons against anyone who questioned his decisions or suggested alternative approaches to governance and social organization. Rather than risk losing control over the political narrative that justified his tyrannical behavior, the vampire king had orchestrated his wife's death through supernatural poison similar to what he had used against Marcus, then created false stories about her weakness and failure to adapt to immortal existence. This revelation destroyed what remained of King Vladislav's support among the ancient nobles, as many had genuinely loved Queen Isabella and mourned her loss without realizing that their grief had been deliberately created by the very person they had trusted to protect and lead their community. The vampire council members who had defended traditional authority now faced the recognition that their loyalty had been systematically manipulated by someone willing to murder his own wife to maintain power, and their horror at this betrayal created a complete collapse of the political coalition that had sustained the vampire king's rule for centuries. King Vladislav realized that his authority had been irretrievably compromised by Lady Morgana's revelations, yet rather than accept defeat, with whatever dignity remained to him, he chose to attempt one final act of destruction that would eliminate both Elena and Marcus, while preserving his vision of vampire superiority through the annihilation of those who had dared to challenge his absolute control. The forbidden magic he began invoking drew upon life force itself as its power source, requiring him to sacrifice his own immortal existence to fuel spells designed to destroy his enemies so thoroughly that not even memories of their rebellion would survive to inspire future challenges to vampire orthodoxy. Ancient words in languages that predated human civilization poured from his lips with increasing urgency as he channeled 8 centuries of accumulated supernatural energy into magic that had been forbidden precisely because it threatened to consume the caster along with the intended victims. The spell's power began manifesting as waves of destructive force that cracked stone pillars and sent supernatural lightning racing through the heart chamber's walls, while the vampire king's physical form began showing signs of the life force drain required to maintain such devastating magical output. Elena felt the temperature in the chamber drop to levels that would have been fatal to unprotected humans as King Vladislav's spell gathered momentum, its energy seeking to tear apart the fundamental bonds that held matter together rather than simply destroying through conventional supernatural violence. The castle's ancient protective spells began unraveling under assault from magic that exceeded their design parameters. Centuries-old enchantments failing one by one as the magical foundations supporting the entire structure came under attack from forces that recognized no limits or boundaries in their destructive potential. Marcus grabbed Elena's hand with desperate strength as he realized his father intended to bring down the entire castle rather than allow his authority to be challenged. The vampire prince's enhanced senses detecting structural failures throughout the fortress, as magical supports designed to last for millennia began collapsing under supernatural pressure that exceeded their theoretical maximum tolerances. The ancient fortress began its death throes with groaning sounds that echoed through stone corridors like the cries of a dying giant. Centuries of accumulated magical energy, seeking escape through cracks that spread across walls designed to contain supernatural forces within carefully controlled parameters. Elena and Marcus fled through passages that shifted and buckled around them as King Vladislav's forbidden spell continued its work of destruction, unraveling not just the physical structure, but the magical bindings that had held vampire society together through generations of political upheaval and external threats. The surviving nobles who supported reform followed Lady Morgana through escape routes that she had apparently prepared for exactly this contingency. Her foresight suggesting that she had anticipated the possibility of her former king choosing mutual destruction over accepting the changes that vampire society desperately needed for its continued survival. Behind them, King Vladislav's voice continued chanting words that grew weaker as the life force drain required by his spell consumed the supernatural energy that had sustained his immortal existence for 8 centuries. His commitment to preserving vampire orthodoxy strong enough to justify his own annihilation if it prevented the corruption he believed Elena represented. The Vampire King's final moments carried a complexity that Elena glimpsed through supernatural senses, enhanced by her trials, his rage and cruelty revealed as stemming from ancient pain that had festered without healing for so long that he had forgotten any other way of existing, except through the exercise of absolute control over everyone around him. His last words, spoken as the spell's power finally overwhelmed his ability to maintain conscious thought, carried genuine regret for becoming the monster that his own unhealed wounds had created, though this recognition came too late to undo the centuries of damage his tyranny had inflicted on everyone unfortunate enough to fall within his sphere of influence. The magical explosion that marked his death sent shockwaves through dimensions beyond normal perception, tearing apart protective barriers that had separated the vampire realm from human awareness, while simultaneously destroying the political structure that had governed supernatural society for longer than most mortal civilizations had existed. Elena and Marcus emerged from the collapsing castle into dawn light that seemed impossibly bright after their time in chambers lit only by torchlight and supernatural energy. The rising sun, revealing a landscape transformed by magical forces that had reshaped the very geography around the fortress during its final destruction. The other survivors gathered in a clearing that offered clear views of the rubble that had once been the seat of vampire political power, their faces showing the uncertainty of people who had lived for centuries under absolute authority, only to find themselves suddenly responsible for creating new systems of governance without the traditional structures they had always depended upon for guidance and stability. Marcus inherited what remained of a fractured kingdom that would require complete rebuilding from philosophical foundations upward, as the old ways had been so thoroughly discredited by his father's actions that no simple reforms could restore trust in institutions that had been corrupted beyond reasonable hope of redemption. Elena realized that her choice to stay and help create something better would not involve accepting the role of submissive consort that traditional vampire society would have demanded, but rather partnership as an equal in the enormous task of building bridges between human and supernatural communities that had been separated by centuries of mutual fear and misunderstanding. The work ahead would be difficult beyond anything either of them had imagined when their relationship began with simple digital messages. Yet the foundation of genuine connection they had discovered during their trials suggested that together they might succeed in creating the kind of future that honored both human values and vampire wisdom, without requiring either group to sacrifice their essential nature for the sake of political convenience or inherited prejudices that no longer served any constructive purpose in a world where cooperation had become necessary for everyone's survival and continued growth. 6 months after the castle's destruction and King Vladislav's death, Elena found herself in a converted warehouse in downtown San Francisco that had been transformed into the headquarters for what they diplomatically called the Nocturnal Cultural Exchange Initiative. Though everyone involved understood it represented something far more revolutionary than its bureaucratic name suggested. The space buzzed with activity that would have seemed impossible during her previous life as a simple graphic designer, navigating the mundane challenges of modern dating and professional deadlines, yet now felt as natural as breathing, despite the supernatural complexities that defined every aspect of their work together. Ancient vampires who had lived through the rise and fall of empires sat at sleek modern workstations, struggling to comprehend email protocols and social media algorithms, while Elena patiently explained concepts like digital privacy and online etiquette that had never been relevant during their centuries of isolation from human technological advancement. Her background in visual design had proven unexpectedly valuable for helping immortal beings adapt to a world where information moved at speeds they found disorienting. Her skills in creating clear communication through images and symbols, serving as a bridge between vampire minds accustomed to thinking in terms of centuries and human systems that operated on timescales measured in seconds and minutes. Marcus spent equal time learning to navigate human society without the supernatural advantages that had always separated him from mortal concerns, discovering through trial and error how to interact with people who remained unaware of his true nature, while maintaining the ethical standards that their new partnership demanded from both vampire and human participants. Their relationship had deepened far beyond the crisis that had brought them together, evolving from desperate attraction, forged in supernatural trials, into genuine partnership based on shared values and complementary strengths that made their collaboration more effective than either could have achieved working alone. The surviving members of the former vampire court had scattered across the globe following their king's death, some embracing the opportunity for change and renewal that Elena's challenge had created, while others retreated into isolation to plot strategies for returning vampire society to the traditional structures they believed represented their species' true destiny. Lady Morgana had established herself as an informal coordinator for the reform movement, using her centuries of accumulated knowledge and political connections to identify vampires who might be receptive to new approaches, while simultaneously monitoring those whose opposition to change posed potential threats to the fragile progress they had achieved through enormous personal sacrifice and risk. The work proceeded slowly due to the vast cultural gaps that had to be bridged between communities that had been separated for so long that they had developed fundamentally different assumptions about everything from basic morality to the nature of power and responsibility. Yet each small success felt like a victory against forces that had seemed insurmountable during those terrifying nights in the collapsing castle. Elena's transformation into a vampire remained her choice to make when she felt ready, rather than an obligation imposed by political necessity or relationship pressure, a freedom that Marcus insisted upon, despite traditions that would have demanded her immediate conversion to seal their partnership according to ancient protocols. Their approach represented a radical departure from vampire customs that had always prioritized supernatural concerns over human agency. Yet this respect for Elena's autonomy had become a cornerstone principle for the new society they were attempting to build through patient negotiation and careful compromise, rather than the authoritarian methods that had characterized vampire governance for centuries. The cultural exchange program operated out of multiple locations across 3 continents, with vampire participants learning to blend into human communities, while human volunteers, who had been carefully vetted for psychological stability and discretion, worked to understand supernatural perspectives that challenged every assumption they had developed about reality and their place within it. Elena often marveled at how far she had traveled from her previous existence of failed Tinder dates and professional frustrations. Though she recognized that the same qualities that had made her successful in graphic design, her attention to detail and ability to communicate complex ideas through visual elements, had proven essential for the much more important work of building bridges between species that had spent centuries viewing each other as either prey or predator rather than potential partners in creating something better than either could achieve alone. The evening that would mark a milestone in their unconventional relationship began with Elena and Marcus standing before the mirror in her San Francisco apartment, both struggling with an irony that would have seemed absurd to anyone who had witnessed the supernatural trials and political upheaval that had brought them together. They were preparing for their first completely normal date, dinner at a regular restaurant where the most dangerous aspect of the experience would be the possibility of disappointing service or overpriced wine rather than ancient curses or political assassination attempts from vampire traditionalists who viewed their partnership as a threat to supernatural orthodoxy. Elena adjusted her dress while Marcus fumbled with cufflinks that didn't require supernatural strength or enhanced reflexes to operate properly, both of them discovering that mundane activities felt strange after months of navigating crises that had demanded every ounce of courage and creativity they possessed. The restaurant Marcus had chosen reflected his growing understanding of human social customs, a small Italian place in North Beach that emphasized intimate conversation over flashy presentation. With lighting dim enough to make his slightly inhuman pallor less noticeable, while maintaining the warm atmosphere that Elena preferred for genuinely relaxed dining experiences. Their conversation flowed with the easy intimacy of people who had shared life-threatening challenges and emerged with a deeper appreciation for simple pleasures like good food and uninterrupted time together, though both remained alert to subtle signs that might indicate supernatural threats from vampires who opposed their reform efforts or humans who had discovered more than they should about the hidden world that operated parallel to conventional society. Marcus had developed remarkable skill at appearing completely human during public appearances, his centuries of aristocratic training serving him well in situations that required charm and social grace while concealing the predatory instincts that remained part of his vampire nature despite his commitment to ethical behavior and respect for human autonomy. Elena found herself appreciating aspects of normal dating that she had taken for granted during her previous relationships with ordinary men who had possessed no supernatural abilities, but also no vision for creating positive change in the world through courage and determination. The irony of their situation provided abundant material for gentle humor as they discussed the contrast between their current concerns about restaurant reservations and wine selections versus the recent past, when their primary worries had involved avoiding execution by ancient vampire nobles who viewed human-vampire relationships as corruption of immortal purity. Their laughter carried genuine joy that had been earned through surviving experiences that would have destroyed weaker partnerships, creating a foundation of shared experience that made ordinary challenges feel manageable by comparison to the supernatural obstacles they had already overcome through teamwork and mutual support. As they debated dessert options with the kind of playful disagreement that characterized healthy relationships, Elena's phone buzzed against the table with an incoming text message from a number she didn't recognize, the notification breaking into their peaceful evening like an unwelcome reminder that their work had created enemies as well as allies among supernatural communities that remained divided about the wisdom of increased contact between vampires and humans. The message was brief, but carried threats that made Elena's blood run cold despite the restaurant's warm atmosphere and Marcus's reassuring presence across the table from her. The old ways are not dead, the text read in stark letters that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent even through the mundane medium of digital communication. "We are watching," the message continued, its implications clear, despite the careful phrasing that avoided specific threats while conveying the unmistakable sense that their relationship and reform efforts had attracted attention from vampires who possessed both the motivation and capability to destroy everything they had worked to build over the past 6 months of careful progress and patient negotiation. Elena showed Marcus the threatening message while maintaining the calm exterior that had served her well during their previous supernatural crises. Her graphic design training helping her analyze the text for visual clues about its sender, while her experience with vampire politics provided context for understanding the deeper implications of contact from opposition forces that had remained silent since King Vladislav's death. Marcus read the words with growing tension that transformed his relaxed dining posture into the alert readiness of someone prepared for immediate combat, his vampire senses extending outward to scan their surroundings for potential threats while his mind calculated strategies for protecting Elena and their fellow reformers from enemies who operated according to rules that prioritized vampire supremacy over any consideration of human welfare or supernatural ethics. The message represented more than simple intimidation, as it demonstrated that traditionalist vampires had been monitoring their activities with sufficient precision to obtain Elena's personal contact information and choose a moment for psychological warfare that would maximize the disruption of their first attempt at normal relationship activities. Yet rather than allowing fear to dominate her response to this obvious attempt at intimidation, Elena found herself smiling with genuine amusement at the timing that had allowed vampire extremists to interrupt their dinner date with threats that seemed almost quaint compared to the life-or-death trials they had already survived through determination and mutual support. She squeezed Marcus's hand across the restaurant table while explaining that threats from people too cowardly to identify themselves held little power over someone who had faced down an ancient vampire king and lived to establish new precedents for supernatural human cooperation. Their revolution had indeed begun during those chaotic nights in the collapsing castle. Yet the war for the future of vampire-human relations was just starting to unfold across multiple fronts that would require all their skills and courage to navigate successfully. Marcus's expression shifted from concern to admiration as he recognized Elena's refusal to be intimidated by anonymous threats, her resilience inspiring him to embrace the challenges ahead with confidence that their partnership could overcome obstacles that would defeat individuals working alone. Whatever enemies emerged from the shadows to oppose their work, they would face these threats together, with the knowledge that their relationship had already survived tests designed to destroy weaker bonds between people who lacked the foundation of genuine respect and shared purpose that had sustained them through their most difficult moments. The evening concluded with renewed determination to continue building bridges between communities that had been separated too long by fear and misunderstanding, their commitment to positive change strengthened rather than weakened by evidence that their efforts had achieved sufficient success to warrant organized opposition from forces that profited from maintaining the status quo of supernatural isolation and human ignorance about the hidden world that existed parallel to conventional society. The ancient Dracal castle stood in moonlight that painted its broken walls and collapsed towers with silver light that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves, rather than from the celestial body that hung above the ruins like a watchful eye surveying the remnants of 8 centuries of vampire political power. Most of the fortress lay in rubble that would take decades to clear completely, its destruction so thorough that archaeologists who eventually discovered the site would struggle to identify the original purpose of structures that had been designed to contain supernatural forces beyond normal human comprehension. Yet in the castle's highest remaining tower, a single window glowed with warm candlelight that flickered against the darkness like a beacon calling to travelers who sought guidance through treacherous territory. The candle had been placed there by Lady Morgana during her final visit to the ruins, its flame sustained by magic that would burn as long as vampires needed hope that change remained possible, despite the opposition they faced from traditionalists who viewed any deviation from ancient ways as betrayal of their immortal heritage. The light served dual purposes that reflected the complex political reality facing supernatural society in the aftermath of King Vladislav's death and the destruction of the old power structures that had governed vampire civilization for generations. For progressive vampires who had embraced Elena's challenge to reform their cruel traditions, the beacon represented sanctuary and welcome for anyone seeking to build better relationships between supernatural and human communities through cooperation rather than domination. For conservative vampires who opposed such changes, the same light functioned as a warning that their former dominance had been permanently shattered, and that new forces now influenced vampire politics with ideas that threatened everything they believed about the natural order that placed immortal beings above mortal concerns and limitations. The candle would continue burning through nights of uncertainty and conflict that lay ahead, its steady flame providing continuity between the old world that had perished in magical fire and the new reality that Elena and Marcus were working to create through patient effort and determination that refused to accept failure as inevitable, despite the enormous challenges they faced from enemies who possessed centuries of accumulated power and knowledge. In villages and cities around the world, vampires looked toward the distant mountains where the Dracal castle had once commanded absolute authority over supernatural politics, some finding comfort in the beacon's promise of renewal, while others began planning the campaigns that would either restore traditional vampire supremacy or destroy the reform movement before it could spread beyond the small group of idealists who had survived the castle's destruction. The war for the future of vampire-human relations had indeed begun, with battle lines drawn between those who believed in the possibility of ethical coexistence and those who viewed such cooperation as weakness that would ultimately lead to the extinction of vampire culture through contamination by human values and morality. Elena and Marcus faced this conflict with resources that included love, determination, and allies who shared their vision of a better world. Yet they also confronted enemies who possessed supernatural abilities, accumulated wealth, and the ruthless willingness to use any methods necessary to preserve the isolation and supremacy that had defined vampire existence for centuries. The beacon in the ruined tower would burn through whatever darkness lay ahead, its light serving as both promise and warning that the age of vampire kings ruling through fear and manipulation had ended, replaced by an uncertain future where the choices made by individuals would determine whether supernatural and human communities would learn to build something better together or destroy each other through conflicts that neither side could ultimately win, without paying prices that would make victory indistinguishable from defeat.